Hello, we're now working on chapter 4 of part 2 of Romano Guardini's book, The Lord. This is entitled Seed and Earth. It continues his discussion of the Sermon on the Mount, and in this situation, in this chapter, we are going to look at the way people responded to Christ, and like how they stood in relationship to what was happening around them, in the way the Lord was interacting with them. And so he starts out how we look at the story of Jesus. He says, we moderns are inclined to answer that Jesus spoke first of all to the individual, then to mankind in general. He says both answers are correct, for only since Jesus Christ doesn't exist, the double calling of the individual and all men, irrespective of race. Nevertheless, the reply, he says, is a little bit too modern to be wholly true. Its simultaneously individualistic and international conception, he says, must be readjusted and purified. What he says is that Jesus himself thinks more historically, primarily concerned with divine history. He never forgets that he was sent, first of all, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. His tidings especially concern those bound by what Guardini calls the covenant of Sinai, the race whom the prophets have taught to expect the coming of the Messiah, to the chosen people under the dominion of regent and official. This, then, the nation, Christ officially, the word used here in its fullest sense as a charge and a mission, calls upon to believe. The yes, the yes of the nation, would have brought about the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy, the all-transforming dawn of the kingdom. When instead the people refused Christ, the repercussions were felt far beyond the limits, he says, of personal salvation, also beyond the historical confines of the Jewish nation. This is how Guardini summarizes it. As the response of the people duty-bound to God, it was the response of the whole human race. What followed meant not only that the tidings were passed on to others, but that now the whole problem of salvation itself was profoundly altered. The failure of the Jewish people to accept Christ was the second fall, the import of which can be fully grasped only in connection with the first. Well, that's in the previous chapter too. The sense of a second fall being the rejection of Jesus by his own people. He goes on, those who heard Christ during his life heard his voice across 1,500 years of history. A circumstance which simultaneously helped and hindered Israel's history. Israel's history had been shaped by its faith in God. Through this faith, the little nation had been able to assert itself against the surrounding empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Egyptians, and Greeks. Secure in its monotheistic belief, it had been able to overcome the spiritual and religious forces around it. However, in this belief in the one and only God, it had also begun to grow harsh and rigid. Consequently, when Jesus' divine message was proclaimed, revealing a God so intrinsically different from the God they had conceived, the Jews were angered. With superhuman courage and tenacity, they had fought for the Sabbath, for the temple and its rights, but in the process, Sabbath, temple, and ritual had become idols. Such then, the background of the people Jesus was addressing. How did the leaders of the people respond to these tidings? Of course, they responded negatively from the first to the last. And Guardini takes us through that. From the start, he says, we see the watching, suspicious faces of the scribes and the Pharisees. The grounds for criticism start out being ritualistic, okay? Like healing on the Sabbath, or the disciples plucking handfuls of grain on the Sabbath, that they don't wash before eating, things like that. But the real reason, however, lies deeper. Jesus' opponents feel that here is a will foreign to their own. What they desire is the perpetuance of the old covenant. God's dominion is to be established in the world, to be established by his chosen race. And when they notice that the new rabbi mentions neither the temple nor the kingdom of Israel, that he actually questions the world and the value of earthly existence, proclaiming the divine government of perfect freedom, they feel he is an alien spirit, and they cannot rest until they have him safely underground. So much for the Pharisees, the strictly orthodox nationalistic conservatives. They hated the rival group, the Sadducees, right? The Sadducees were liberal, progressive, and influenced by Greek culture. They at first pay no attention whatsoever to the dreamer. However, once the movement becomes suspiciously powerful, they actually join forces with their despised opponents long enough to put an end to this dangerous one. Then Guardini takes on the problem of the masses. When those in authority failed, it was up to the masses to obey the impulse of Palm Sunday, and fired by the spirit that the prophet Joel calls messianic, to recognize the Messiah and to proclaim their allegiance to him. But this does not happen. The people do have a certain instinct for Jesus. They come to him for help in their need. They listen to his words, are shaken by his miracles. At times they sense the messianic mystery that enfolds him. They even try to make him king. But their conduct is confused. At the very beginning in Nazareth, a wave of such jealousy sweeps over them that they attempt to take his life. Later, in Gerasa, when he heals the possessed boy and the herd of swine plunges into the sea, they conclude that he must be dangerous and urge him to go elsewhere. When he passes through Samaria on his way to Galilee, they receive him amicably, right? Like in John chapter 4. However, when he returns from the opposite direction on his way to hated Jerusalem, they don't even allow him to enter the city. The masses sense his power and significance, but indeterminately. What is felt is not coordinated into responsible action. For this, a guiding hand is needed, and it's not there. Now, how fittingly, Guardini says, one of Jesus' friends or disciples might have bridged the gulf between him and the masses. They might have gathered the hearts of the crowd and led them to the decision. But Jesus' followers are afraid and remain in the background. Thus, the people are delivered over to the Pharisees, who make easy game of them, deftly leading them from the enthusiasm of Palm Sunday to the apostasy of Good Friday. And then Guardini talks about the political forces of the day. They should also be mentioned. They remain neutral, right? The actual power was in the hands of the Romans. Pilate only learns of Jesus' existence through his denunciation. And at first, Pilate took the prisoner for one of the many hotheads of the times. He soon realized, however, that he was dealing with something extraordinary. Belief that higher beings or sons of God appeared on earth was not uncommon in those days. And Pilate grew uneasy and tried to free him. But in the end, he too conceded to the pressure of the accusers. And then Guardini takes us through his relationship to Herod, where Herod and Pilate become friends, even though Herod makes a mockery of Jesus. Then we look at the intimates of the Lord. And Guardini says, well, Mary was linked closely with him. We've already spoken of their relationship. There's not much more to be said, he says. With Jesus' next of kin, his brothers, it's a different story. And then he points out that in the dealings with his family members, they misunderstand him, and they also keep distance from him. And indeed, in one of the situations when everyone was coming to see him, the family tries to restrain him, and they say he's gone mad. So they don't understand him, they close their hearts to him, it goes along. And the disciples, well, during Jesus' lifetime, it says, not one of them suggests a great personality. Before Pentecost, they're still all too human. It's actually depressing, Guardini says, to see Jesus among them. Uncomprehending, they degrade everything. They're jealous of each other, they take advantage of their position, and when the test comes, fail. Already in Capernaum, when Jesus introduces the Holy Eucharist, his followers begin to murmur among themselves. Many of his disciples declare, how can one listen to such things? And they turn away. At this, the Lord asks the 12 if they want to go too. The answer hardly rings with vital conviction. Shaken, bewildered, they rescue themselves in blind faith. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. Among these is Judas, who's already lined his pockets from the common purse. And when it comes to the seizure, at the Passion, they all flee. And Peter denies his master. So now you have the problem, and Guardini has set this up nicely. He says, who then was really open to Jesus' message? First of all, quiet individuals, he says. People inclined by nature, perhaps, to enthusiasm or aloofness. These people actually distance themselves from the constant influx of political events in Jerusalem, from the differences of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They lived completely in the tradition of the prophets, quietly waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise. To these belonged Zachary, the priest, Elizabeth, Mary's cousin, Simeon the prophet, Anna, the ancient seer, Lazarus with his two sisters, and a good many others. They came closest to understanding the Lord, but perhaps also not rightly, possibly for they were too individualistic. Then there were the social outcasts, Guardini points out, the publicans and sinners, the ones hated as the enemies of the people because they sided with the Romans for economic considerations, or the others who were despised as dishonorable. What was otherwise their misfortune was perhaps here their salvation. Having no social position to lose, they were more open, readier for the out of the ordinary. They considered Jesus an overthrower of worldly opinion, and they flocked to him. Was he not accused of being a friend of publicans and sinners? But of course, when it came to the ultimate decision, such people had no influence whatsoever. So Guardini points out the big surprise in the New Testament. There's a third group, the heathen. Now, Jesus' manner of speaking of them is notable. His words seem to take on a special warmth, almost longing. When the captain tells him it's unnecessary for him to come personally to his sick servant, he has to but command the illness to leave and it will obey. Jesus is both delighted and saddened. Amen, I say to you, he says, not even in Israel have I found so great a faith. Something similar occurs in the incident of the Canaanite woman. Her faith is great enough and humble enough to allow her to understand that Jesus has been sent first to all the children of the house of David, to the chosen people, and that she herself is like one of those little dogs that hopes for the crumbs that fall from the master's table. But listen to this. Her faith in divine abundance for all is unshakable. Okay, so she's one of the most remarkable people in the scriptures because she has this unshakable faith in divine abundance. When I was going through this with one of the discussion groups, I thought about another woman in church history who had that kind of unshakable faith in divine abundance. I would say Therese the Little Flower was like that. She was able, in a spirit of simplicity and humility, to just approach Jesus and believe in divine abundance. See, and that really is remarkable, I think. So Guardini goes on here. The general impression of the heathen that the Lord must have had is evident in the words which he threatens the cities of Israel at the time of the Galilean crisis. He says, "Woe to thee, Chorazin! Woe to thee, Bethsaida! For if in Tyre and Sidon," those are pagan cities, "had been worked the miracles that have been worked in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." So Jesus is saying that the pagans' response in faith is actually stronger than the people in Israel. And he goes on, "It was among the heathen that Jesus found open souls and fresh, ready hearts." And so Guardini gives an analysis here that I think is really important. Only too often, ancient religious tradition, long training, and hard and fast usage stamp the ground hard. The spirit no longer takes any imprint. The heart remains cool or undecided, and rarely does feeling become that passion which demands absolute earnestness. So we used to talk about this in another way. We used to talk about people who got, it's a similar kind of idea. They could get enough of religion to not get Jesus very clearly in their mind. So they were kind of like inoculated against Jesus. And that's what Guardini's describing here, I think. That the people were so used to a certain religious mindset that when Jesus comes along, they're not ready for the surprises of the Lord. And on the other hand, Guardini points out the heathen were like rich virgin soil. They didn't have any expectations in the same way. They were the frontier country, he says, of endless possibilities. They too had little effect on the imminent decision that was made about the people making to reject Jesus. The ground on which Jesus' words fell was hard ground indeed. But Guardini goes on with a warning about our attitude about listening to the story of Jesus. He says this: we're accustomed to accepting the course of the Lord's life on earth as predetermined. Because it was as it was, we conclude that it was meant to be so. We judge everything by its outcome and forget how monstrous, in the eyes of both God and man, the means by which it was accomplished. Now, we've seen this theme before in Guardini. He's reminding us again that the way Jesus died, from the human point of view, and from the eye, as he says here, from the eyes of both God and man, it's monstrous. He says we have entirely lost the Middle Ages reaction of horror at the thought of God's murder. Okay? He goes on, we must strip ourselves of our customary callousness, that is, our callousness about these events, and realize how frightful the whole procedure was, how hardened men's hearts, how paltry Jesus' reception. In other words, he's saying we get too used to the story, and we miss the significance of this horrible event. It seems to me that human tragedy, if we understand it correctly, has a way of waking us up again. These existential shocks of death that we experience remind us of how monstrous the Lord's death was. At least that's my own experience. And there's a way Guardini is saying that we have to kind of feel our way back to that kind of attitude. That's what he says. He says, not until we have felt our way back to this attitude will we understand Christ's word, where he said, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. Okay? Jesus knew that in the last analysis, mankind's unique, limitless possibility was not frustrated by human will alone. For this, humans, in spite of all their presumption and violence, are much too insignificant. In other words, Jesus was facing down not only the human opponents among the people, he was facing down the evil spiritual opponents, Satan and his minions. But Guardini goes on to say a question. He raises that question about God. He says, who is this God who seems to lack the power to bring about the Son's due reception? He says, what a strangely disturbing impression of weakness he makes. And what wicked, dogged power is this thing called world that is capable of hardening itself against God's summons and cold-bloodedly making an end of his envoy, that is, killing Jesus. What kind of God must this be to remain silent before such things? You know, and he asks questions too about why. There's this, the why in Guardini is important here. He says, it's incomprehensible that things could go as they did, when after all, he was who he was. This is God. This is the Son of God. Why, he says, was none of those in power receptive and courageous? Why was there no one there to lead the people to Christ? Why were his disciples, humanly speaking, so inadequate? So he asks the question, why? And he asks the question, who is this God? No, we're into the W questions here. And I'm reminded, this echoes the line in Pope John Paul II's essay, his apostolic letter, Salvifici Doloris, on the Christian meaning of human suffering, which is would be the English title. And in that, he's reflecting on Jesus' suffering and our suffering. And he says that God welcomes the why. So here's Guardini taking God up on that question. And yet it's not a question that I think people want to linger on. I think it's really uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable question. It seems to me that the question why, when it comes to the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of other people, is linked to the cry of Jesus on the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? So that's the reason I think it's ultimately quite uncomfortable, because it has to do with that feeling of the absence of God. Now, remember, I think that the absence of God is a feeling, but even when God seems utterly absent, it's revealed to us right at that moment on the cross that God is there. God is in the suffering. So there's a tremendous mystery that's hard to get our head around. And unfortunately, I think we don't spend enough time with it. We don't allow that why to permeate our conscience to the point where God can bring us to a resolution of it. In other words, we're not that willing to wrestle with it. And here is Guardini urging us to kind of wrestle with it, I think. He goes on to say, we live so thoughtlessly that we no longer feel the impact of such unheard of conduct. How do men imagine the advent of divinity on earth? And then Guardini gives examples from non-Christian ways of thinking about the advent of God on earth. He says, the myths suggest outpourings of dynamic radiance. Buddha is an ascetic, but he thrones in more than royal esteem. He mentions the sage Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu is venerated as a god. He says, Muhammad gallops across the world at the head of victorious armies. Here, though, bringing us back to Christianity, here, though, God himself becomes man. He has a divinely grave interest in Jesus' human existence. His own honor is at stake, his omnipotence. And what happens? What happens? The long history of the Old Testament has been painstakingly directed toward the coming of the Messiah, yet when he does come, this mysterious hardening of people's hearts, this inexplicable fate. And then he goes on again with another question. What God is this that such things could happen to his son? Like, again, he's just grappling with this mystery from all different angles. It's just really bothering him. He's setting up this real discomfort in our reading. One of the discussion group members was telling me how this made them depressed to read this. And I think there's a sense of almost, why was his reception so paltry? Why didn't people pay more attention to Jesus? Why didn't they make the world a better place? Why didn't they greet him better? Why didn't they cooperate with him more? It was that kind of thing. And when he comes, look what happens. So Guardini pushes this even further and says, surely we begin to feel the otherness of Christianity, right? Those other divinities, he's referring to the other religions. Those other divinities, in quotation marks, were earthly powers, and earth recognizes and loves what is hers. When something truly from elsewhere comes, however, how different the response. Gradually we sense what it must be to be a Christian. To be allegiance bound to such a God in a world that is as it is. No wonder it means estrangement. So here Guardini is really challenging us to recognize that we are strangers and pilgrims in this world due to the fact that God himself came and was murdered. He was rejected. And then Guardini lands the punch right to our hearts. Listen to this. He asks another question. And doesn't world in reality mean ourselves? Huh? In other words, this world in the New Testament that's opposed to Jesus, that ultimately kills Jesus. He says, and doesn't world in reality mean ourselves? Not only that which is outside of ourselves, that which is about us, he says. No, that in us, which is close to the divine, is somehow alien to us, and we have good grounds for the Christian fear that what happened once might be repeated in us. The second fall, the closing of our own hearts to God. In other words, when you look at the account of the way Jesus was treated, ultimately it comes back to us and to the question that is in us, that when we try to get close to God, there's something inside of us that refuses God, and therefore we have good grounds, he says, for the Christian fear that what happened once back then in New Testament times might be repeated in us. That is the second fall, the closing of our own hearts to God. So we end this chapter with the question, how do we keep our hearts open to God? How do we love God more and more in the face of the reality of our own tendency to shut our hearts down? Seems to me that that willingness to open again, even in the face of grave difficulty and suffering, that we choose at that point in our life to open again instead of to retreat, to run away. That is the first step. And it reminds me of that song, "Open the eyes of my heart, Lord, open the eyes of my heart, that I may see you." Let us pray that the example of the Lord, as Guardini gives it to us here in chapter 4 of part 2, can open us up again so that we don't make the heart mistake of the second fall. Thank you very much.